Hello and welcome to this edition of Global Business on CGTN. I'm Lulu, and these are the headlines we're tracking at this hour. Commitment to growth. China vows to roll out fiscal measures to bolster growth and continue to enhance coordination between central bank and financial authorities. Strengthening ties. China and Switzerland have concluded negotiations on an upgrade to their free trade agreement and signed an MOU. Grim milestone. U.S. national debt has passed $40 trillion after doubling in a decade. And we explore what that means for the U.S. economy. As usual, a quick check on Chinese mainland markets when we kick off the show, where we see key indices finished the week's trading in the gains. The benchmark Shanghai Composite Index, however, finished the day adding a mere 1.5 points there, barely changed at the end of the day. But we do see gains in Shenzhen. The main body in Shenzhen added about 0.8% or close to 0.9% already. And tech shares in Shenzhen jumped 50 points. That is by 1.4%. We're going to get your ringside view of market actions later on in the program. But now let's check out how regional markets are performing and how Wall Street closed overnight. China's Vice Finance Minister Liao Ming says that Beijing will roll out additional fiscal measures to bolster growth. At a news conference today, Liao said that China will continue to enhance coordination between the central bank and financial authorities. He stressed that policy continuity and stability with longer-term planning of fiscal resources. Fiscal spending will be targeted toward people-centered investment and boosting domestic consumption. He also called for deeper fiscal and tax reforms, improved budget management, and clearer central-local fiscal responsibilities to balance regional development. Let's get more discussions on from China's fiscal policy toolbox for the rest of the year. And now we're joined by Professor Wang Yaojing from Peking University. Professor Wang, thank you so much for being with us. So let's start with this. What kind of key manifestation can we see of this year's more proactive fiscal policy, and what direct economic impacts have these measures delivered so far?
Well, thank you for having me, Lily. So the more proactive fiscal policy is visible in three main areas. First is greater spending capacity and also earlier policy implementation and also closer coordination between the fiscal and financial tools. On the demand side, we have witnessed how the trade-in subsidies have encouraged households to replace cars, appliances, and digital products. And on the investment side, government bonds are supporting major national projects, infrastructure renewal, and also industrial upgrading. And for private and smaller businesses, fiscal interest subsidies and government-backed financing are helping them obtain credit at lower cost. And on the local government side, transfers are increased to protect essential public services and then also easing fiscal pressures at the grassroots level. So the impact is therefore quite direct. Consumer incentives generate retail sales, project funding creates investment and employment, and financing supports improves business confidence. And I also want to point out that fiscal policy is no longer relying solely on direct government spending, but is also more increasingly using limited public funds to mobilize bank lending, private investment, and also household consumption. So yes, this year's fiscal policy is larger in scale, faster in implementation, and also more targeted in its transmission. It is supporting the short-term demand while also investing in economics' long-term productivity capacity.
Okay, and also there are signs that fiscal spending is now shifting toward more human-centered investment and consumption stimulation. So what concrete policy moves can market participants expect?
Well, market participants can expect physical spending to become more closely connected with people's everyday needs. This includes greater support for childcare, education, healthcare, elderly care, and employment, alongside with continued measures to stimulate consumption. And the key change is that these two objectives are increasingly being combined. For example, better childcare and elderly care service reduce the financial and time burden facing the families, while also creating new demand and employment in the service sector. In the same way, improvement in healthcare and social security can reduce precautionary saving and give households greater confidence to consume. And besides households, businesses are always also expecting stronger support for service consumption. We see fiscal interest subsidies are being extended to more consumer activities and a broader range of financial institutions as well. Also, small business and services, as we mentioned earlier, are getting these financing support to getting more credits at lower cost. And this should benefit sectors such as tourism, culture, catering, healthcare, and household services. So investing in people should not be understood simply by increasing welfare expenditure. It is a strategy that combines social development with economic growth, which is to improve people's well-being, strengthen human capital, and also unlock more sustainable consumption.
And also, we can expect a notable amount of local government special purpose bonds to be issued in the second half of the year. So how will this help to drive local economic growth?
Well, this new round of bond financing can support local growth through a simple chain. While funds enable project generates orders and employment, and better infrastructure raises future productivity. So in the shorter term, special purpose bonds give local governments the financial capacity to accelerate projects that are already prepared but waiting for funding. This can immediately increase demand for construction, equipment, materials, and also labor. It can also improve cash flows for firms participating in these public projects. And the second effect is financial leverage. So government funding can provide the initial capital or reduce the project risk, encouraging banks and private companies and other investors to participate. So 1 yuan of public financing can stimulate additional social capital. And the third effect is structural. And if these funds are directly towards the urban renewal, transportation, digital infrastructure, or green development, they will not only stabilize current demand, but also improve the local business environment and create new growth opportunities.
Well, thank you so much for your insights. That's Professor Wang Yaojing from Peking University for us. And this year's World Robot Conference has introduced 4 theme days, and today is its Developer Day. It brings together developers from around the world to exchange ideas, showcase their work, and explore ways to build a stronger robotics ecosystem. Sun Tianyuan has more.
Developers, researchers, and industry leaders have gathered here to discuss the next stage of robotics development. And one focus is how to bring more developers into the process. And that includes building an open source community around humanoid robots. This morning, industry leaders discussed open source ecosystems and ways to encourage more developers to take part in embodied AI development. Participants call for greater access to resources, including data, technical support, and hardware. And the aim is to bring together existing resources and support further technology development. And another initiative launched at the conference yesterday focuses on testing new applications. Selected teams will be given access to robots free of charge, and they can use the machines to test their ideas in real-world settings. For smaller development teams and startups, access to hardware can be a major cost. The program allows developers to test their applications without having to purchase the robots themselves. That's really what today's discussions are about, building a stronger robotics ecosystem and giving more people access to the tools they need to test new ideas. Sun Tianyuan, CGTN, Beijing.
6G will fundamentally reshape global connectivity by merging AI with communications, extending seamless coverage from ground to space and sea. It links not only people and machines, but also self-learning intelligent agents. The next generation network turns every device into a sensor using radio waves to see its surroundings, enabling autonomous driving and smart factories without extra hardware. With integrated sensing, computing, and AI, 6G will unlock entirely new industries like the low-altitude economy and satellite internet. The goal is not just faster speeds, but a reliable, always-on connection everywhere, from crowded stadiums to the middle of the ocean. 6G is still years away from commercial rollout, but Shanghai is already positioning itself for the next generation of mobile technology. In 2025, the city launched a plan to develop its 6G industry, with commercial deployment in China expected around 2030. Lei Shuran reports.
Shanghai's Songjiang district is emerging as one of the city's main bases for developing 6G-related technologies. A 123,000 square meter industrial park there is now home to more than 120 companies, including around 40 linked to the 6G industrial chain. One of them is developing wearable brain-computer interface technology. Its current devices can allow users to place a coffee order without touching a screen. The developer says similar technology could eventually be used to control smart home appliances and robots. And as the number of connected devices grows, the company says future networks will need to handle many more connections at the same time.
For example, a smartphone can currently connect to around 10 Bluetooth devices at most. But as the number of smart home devices and eventually robots grows rapidly, 6G will need to support simultaneous short-range connections with more than 20 or even more than 30 devices.
Other companies in the park are looking at how 6G could support much larger AI systems. One developer of intelligent airport inspection technology says faster, lower latency networks could allow a single AI agent to process data from far more cameras in real time.
Our AI can operate 24 hours a day. With 5G, one AI can monitor 500 cameras. With 6G, one AI could potentially handle more than 10,000. And because our AI needs to anticipate events, a difference of just a few seconds can change a lot.
Local authorities are also putting money behind the push. Songjiang has launched a 300 million yuan fund to support the development of 6G-related businesses. Selected major science and technology projects, as well as companies newly recognized as unicorn enterprises, can also qualify for additional incentives.
Over the past 2 years, we've developing this platform. As a potentially disruptive technology for future industries, much of the work involves turning research from the laboratory into practical applications. Our platform helps companies turn scientific and technological research into commercial output.
The park now brings together incubators, proof-of-concept facilities, testing services, and technology companies, as Songjiang tries to build a broader 6G industrial ecosystem. By 2030, the wider 6G industrial cluster in Songjiang is expected to generate more than 100 billion yuan in annual industrial value. Lei Shuran, SMG International for CGTN, Shanghai.
Artificial intelligence has revolutionized virtual world technology, but building robots that can operate flawlessly in the physical world remains a major hurdle. 6G, however, is closing this critical gap, opening the next frontier for smart physical robotics for industrial and future consumer applications.
It flips, jumps, and climbs. At this specialized test site, a 4-legged robot negotiates punishing obstacle courses, undergoing real-world performance evaluations.
We are testing its motion control stability across multiple scenarios and complex terrains, including slopes, rubble-strewn surfaces, and other A complete closed loop of sensing decision execution must be fully functional. Every link imposes extremely high requirements on latency and stability. A delay of just a fraction of a second can trigger critical errors.
Existing networks, including 5G-A, hit hard limits here. Slow signal response cannot sustain the robust long-hour, high-precision operations. 6G changes that. Delivering near-instant latency, massive device connectivity, and ultra-stable signals, the site replicates real-life working conditions, smoothing robust transition from lab prototypes to field deployment.
It enables the cloud-based AI brain to govern physical robots within milliseconds.
6G power cloud computing also relieves the robots from bulky onboard hardware, making them lighter, less costly, and longer lasting.
Our robot has secured orders for nearly 100 units so far, and mass delivery is expected by the end of this year.
The facility offers end-to-end support for local companies covering research, training, and certification. The test site is projected to push local intelligent robot industry output about 10 billion yuan by 2027.
Even when hundreds of devices connect simultaneously, data transmission and command synchronization remain stable.
With large-scale 6G commercial rollout expected around 2030, the technology is pulling AI out of virtual simulations and into tangible real-world deployments. Aaron Liu, CGTN.
And you're watching Global Business on CGTN. Still to come on the program. Strengthening ties. China and Switzerland have concluded negotiations on an upgrade to the free trade agreement and signed a memorandum of understanding.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business. Only on CGTN.
Let's now go to check on how equity markets on the Chinese mainland, Hong Kong and Tokyo wrapped up the week. And for that, we head over to Timothy Pope in Shanghai. Tim, it's been another pretty volatile week for Chinese mainland equities. So what do we need to know about the week's trading?
Well, Lily, the Chinese mainland markets are defined by that volatility at the moment, as well as aggressive sector rotations. Today, the energy was back in tech and AI and growth stocks. So the broader Shanghai Composite Index essentially went nowhere. There was tech, energy, biotech pulling upwards, and consumer, real estate and utilities pulling downwards. The Shenzhen component was up 0.9%. The China export added 1.4%. And that tells us that investors are getting back into tech and AI stocks after Wednesday's epic plunge. And this has really been the theme for the markets lately. Investors, I think a good way of describing it, investors are behaving a bit like they're trying to get into a really hot bath. It's not long before they can't stand that heat and they have to jump out. Then after a minute, they jump right back in again. And the bath in this case is exposure to highly crowded AI and technology stocks with growing valuation questions. And this is the same basic question now that has been asked previously in the US. Are future earnings actually going to justify these prices? A great case study this week actually was the Unitree IPO. I initially thought the company had picked a great day to debut, coinciding with the opening of the World Robot Conference in Beijing, but it actually turned out to be the worst possible day this week. Investors were leaping out of the bath on that day. Even so, its stock surged. It closed 460% higher, and at one point on its first trading day, it was trading at 857 times projected 2026 earnings. That is a really extreme example, but it really isn't alone. CXMT is trading at nearly 130 times earnings today, with only a really small proportion of its shares actually available to trade. And when you start seeing that sort of thing, it's no wonder that the water starts feeling a little bit hot. Okay, I've tortured that analogy enough, but this week we also saw investors piling into some other favourites, biotech and food security stocks among them. Food security is currently another reporting obsession of mine, and these concerns about extreme weather, geopolitical disruption and China's push for greater food self-sufficiency really gained quite a bit of traction with investors as well.
And also around region in the markets were pretty trading mixed on earnings and also Middle East uncertainty. So walk us through what happened in Hong Kong and Tokyo.
Yeah, this week in Hong Kong, it's been pretty much all about earnings. Today, the Hang Seng added 1.2%. The big one we were watching today was Alibaba, which initially rose pretty strongly on a quarterly revenue gain of 9%, but ended the session 2.5% lower. The total revenue increase was a little bit above the consensus estimate as well, thanks to strong demand for AI services that boosted Alibaba's cloud business. This is a case where investors are looking at the AI infrastructure spending that companies are doing and wondering if that's the best use of their profits. Others we saw this week were Baidu and Kuaishou, both of which fell following the release of their quarterly reports, which showed revenue and profits down while AI spending spiked. So in Hong Kong, it's less about valuations and more about spending. In Tokyo, the Nikkei had a really bad week. It ended today 0.3% lower, but is down around 4% for the week. It's its worst week this month, and it was hit hard by the midweek tech sell-off. And then worries about the US-Iran war situation made everything worse after oil jumped overnight in response to a threat of more US sanctions against Iran. 70% of Japanese oil comes through the Straits of Hormuz, so we saw that that was a cause for inflation worries, sending bond yields higher. And it became a vicious circle. Those bond yields also make bonds look more attractive than potentially overvalued AI supply chain stocks. And latest economic data really only reinforced that picture, with exports and imports both hitting record highs because of rising oil prices. And that makes one big thing Japan is also importing at the moment: inflation, Lily.
Well, good stuff. Thank you so much for the market update. That's Timothy Pope for us in Shanghai. China and Switzerland have concluded negotiations on an upgrade to their free trade agreement and signed a memorandum of understanding. This was announced by Swiss President Guy Parmelin and Chinese Commerce Minister Wang Wentao after a meeting in Bern, Switzerland. They vowed to speed up their country's procedures to pave the way for the official signing of the upgrade protocol. The China-Switzerland Free Trade Agreement was signed in 2013 and took effect in 2014. It's the first free trade agreement between China and a continental European country. And now let's get some discussions and insights on China's trade relationship with the European Union. For that, we're joined by Chen Jiahe, Chief Investment Officer at Novamarket Technologies. Hi there, Jiahe. So how can this newly established China-EU trade and investment consultation mechanism help to ease frictions over tools such as the foreign subsidies regulations in the month ahead?
Well, currently, the trade between China and the European Union is very important for both economies. In the first half of this year, we can see that the trade between China and the EU increased by almost 15% compared with last year. So this is a very important driver to the economic growth of both China and Europe. When there is so much trade, there will definitely be frictions from time to time. Businesses will argue with each other. Trading companies will complain about the business activities. There will be problems when you do so much businesses with each other. So such a mechanism that is recently established to sort out the problems between China and the European Union, which is the China and the EU trade and investment consultation mechanism, is definitely very important for easing all these frictions. With such a mechanism, when there is some friction appearing between the two economies, there will be a place where we can negotiate to reach agreement before making retaliation actions that could hurt the trade of both economies. Therefore, such a kind of mechanism that allows a negotiation to happen and to avoid damaging actions is quite important for building up a healthy trading relationship between China and the European Union.
Jiahe, let's zoom in on the green industries like new energy vehicles or PVs. They have become a major growth driver, but also a point of tension for China-EU trade. So where do you see the biggest room for win-win collaboration?
Yes, currently the green industry is one of the most important drivers for the trade between China and the European Union. And when there is a rising amount of trade, there will be frictions and arguments. And that's something very natural. So we should not be worrying when we see these kinds of arguments happening between China and the European Union. When there is a rising trade of green economy, there will be tensions, but there will be much more profit above all these tensions for both economies. Looking into the trade of green economy, we can see that China and the EU are actually supporting the growth of each other. The European Union is good with producing high-end machines, researching leading technologies, developing new materials, all sorts of things. Meanwhile, China has a huge market and a vast industrial system that is capable of producing the products with high efficiency, good quality, and a low price. Therefore, the cooperation between two economies can actually make each other stronger than before. With such a profit available for both economies, I believe as long as we have enough negotiation, the tensions and the frictions will finally be sorted out.
Jia He, so the EU is now putting forward more regulatory frameworks. So that said, what kind of adjustments should Chinese businesses prioritize when mapping out their Europe-bound strategies?
Well, when Chinese companies are entering a different economy in order to conduct the business and trade there, it is very important to understand the regulatory framework of that place, especially when these companies are facing the European market, which is a place that has been famous for putting out many detailed regulations. There are two very important things for the business strategies when facing such a situation. The first one is the understanding of specialized regulation. A lot of legal work has to be conducted by the company in order to avoid the potential damage that can be caused by breaking these regulations. The second, which is very important, is predicting the move of regulatory requirements. Because if the businesses choose their strategies and make actions only after the regulations are made, they will actually bear a lot of cost for the transferring of business activities. But if they can predict where the regulation might be in the next few years, a lot of actions can be taken in advance. So I think predicting the future changing of regulations is a very important work for businesses. This requires very intellectual and strategic work, which can only be conducted with a deep understanding of the economic, social, political, and legal environment.
Well, great stuff. Thank you so much for those insights, Jia He. That's Jia He from Northern Market Technologies. And still to come here on Global Business. Grim milestone. U.S. national debt surpasses $40 trillion after doubling in the past decade. We explore what does it mean for the U.S. economy.
A vast land of 1.4 billion people. The world's second largest economy. Home to stories of the unexpected, the unimaginable, the breathtaking. Stories that touch the soul. Feel the speed, the passion. Enjoy spectacular natural and cultural landscapes. Feel the thrill of cutting-edge innovations. Discovering China. Global Biz. China Travel. We present to China never seen before. 24/7 at your fingertips.
Welcome back. U.S. national debt has passed $40 trillion after doubling in a decade. As the government spends more to cover its budget deficits, the Treasury has announced an intervention in the bond market. Our correspondent Jagrudi Devi is in Washington, D.C. with the latest on the bond market and also Donald Trump's reaction to the Fed's openness to raising rates.
He's long expressed frustration that the Fed isn't cutting interest rates, saying it's the way, in his view, to help economic growth. He's criticised former Federal Chair Jerome Powell for keeping interest rates, as he's put it, artificially high. Now, he's recently been talking about this, expressing further frustration that the Fed isn't making more cuts. And he said that his replacement, Jerome Powell's replacement, Kevin Marsh, is doing a great job, but he's alleging that other members might be politically motivated in keeping rates high, although officials at the Fed have maintained their political independence throughout. Now, at the last Fed meeting, members said, and this was at the end of July, decided that they would keep interest rates unchanged at between 3.5 and 3.75%. But the minutes released on Wednesday show that more members thought interest rates should go up to bring inflation down to the Fed's target of 2%. Now, I should say that inflation is currently at 3.4% at the end of July, and that's cooled slightly from the previous month. And we know from the minutes that 3 Fed presidents have voted against holding the rates steady. What's interesting about these recent minutes is that it shows that most Fed officials thought that inflation would cool, but many thought that it would still stay elevated because of rising energy prices from the Iran war and the long-term impacts of the president's tariff policy. So this is significant because it shows divisions among the members, and that despite previous cuts in interest rates, clearly keeping their policy tight is still on the table. Scott Bessent told CNBC that the US could buy back more than $4 million of long-term debt. This was the limit that Bessent had originally announced on Wednesday. He didn't say how much more the buyback scheme would grow in size, but he said that that would be determined by the bond market. Now, bond yields briefly went down while Bessent was speaking, but they climbed back again. Now, yields are essentially the interest that are paid on bonds, and we've seen the bond yields, as I say, jumping up again. The 10-year bond yield rose as high as 4.7%. The 30-year yield went up to almost 5.3%. Now, ING analysts are saying that all of this move announced by Bessent was like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. And that's because it doesn't reduce the amount of debt the US government owes. It just shifts the balance to more short-term debt over long-term debt. And that's important given the broader context of the US government debt breaking the $40 trillion barrier.
So what is behind the record surge in US government debt, and what does it mean for American households and the global economy? Here's a look.
Words of warning from economists as the United States' national debt crossed $40 trillion for the first time. According to the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, a fiscal watchdog group, the surge in U.S. debt over the past decade is staggering.
If you care about affordability, you should be all over your representative in Washington to start to address this problem, because it's a contributing factor. And if we reined in our federal spending and showed a long-term fiscal path that was sustainable, rates would come down, and therefore everything else would get less expensive. So you don't have to pay the bill on the national debt personally, but we are paying the bill as a society and in the cost of living.
The Peterson Foundation attributed the debt rise to 3 main drivers: changing demographics, rising healthcare costs, and inadequate federal revenues. It projected that the national debt will reach $50 trillion in just 6 years if the U.S. stays on its current path.
We've gotten to the point at which the debt and the interest costs represent a huge burden, not only just on our future kids and grandkids, but on our citizens today.
Nobody's paid their dues. That favor is actually never fully paid.
Experts warn that higher debt levels could drag on the economy by dampening business investment and holding back wages, while also making a severe financial crisis more likely.
This could disrupt global financial markets and trigger sharp volatility in capital flows. U.S. Treasury bonds serve as the benchmark for global asset pricing. Excess debt supply, rising yields, or heightened volatility could lead to a repricing of global assets, putting pressure on stock, bond, and currency markets alike.
It is also worth considering that the surging U.S. debt, accompanied by dollar depreciation and liquidity spillovers, could drive up the global cost of living. It would also erode the stability of the international monetary system and thus increase global transaction costs and heighten economic uncertainty.
The United States has announced it will impose the toughest sanctions in history on Iran as it seeks to resolve a war that began nearly 6 months ago. Details have not been revealed. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent urges allies to make a decision on where they stand.
So it is time for our allies and the rest of the world to make a decision, and we are going to squash the economy of this regime. And what we have seen, I see lots of reports that said, oh, well, this has never worked. It does work because we have a combination. It is a 1-2 punch. We have the blockade, and we are going to have the toughest sanctions in history.
The Treasury Secretary's comments followed President Donald Trump's threat a day earlier of economic warfare. Trump has threatened any country that trades with Iran. The U.S. has also announced sanctions on 10 individuals that it considers as part of a network responsible for transferring cash to Lebanon's Hezbollah, which is backed by Tehran. CGTN's Walter Morris reports from Washington.
Well, U.S. President Donald Trump says his team is no longer negotiating with Tehran, and now he's promising economic warfare and isolation on an unprecedented scale. Now, Trump made his latest threats in a social media post Wednesday evening. He wrote on Truth Social that it will be, quote, the most crushing economic operation ever taken against any country. As part of Trump's economic D-Day, he says any country that allows its financial institutions, businesses, airports, or government entities to assist Iran will also face tremendous economic consequences. The announcement comes days after White House officials revealed the administration is shifting its strategy in Iran. The conflict is now approaching its 7th month, and following Trump's announcement, oil prices climbed 2% Thursday. The Trump administration is also facing mounting economic pressure at home. The American Automobile Association says U.S. gas prices climbed 1 cent this week. According to AAA, the national average is now at $4.10 a gallon. And this week, more U.S. military personnel arriving in the region. The Pentagon says the USS George Washington arrived in the Middle East Wednesday. Senior military officials say the aircraft carrier was sent to the Gulf to relieve the USS Abraham Lincoln. The rotation leaves the United States without an aircraft carrier in the Pacific. The Lincoln has been at sea for an extended deployment due to the war in Iran. And recently, some lawmakers and military families have raised concerns about the mental health of Lincoln crew members due to the long deployment. And the U.S. Treasury Secretary says he'll provide more details about the next steps and new sanctions against Iran Monday.
Iran's foreign ministry has condemned the U.S. economic and trade sanctions against Iran as economic terrorism. Iranian Foreign Minister Saeed Abbas Araghchi says that Washington's moves threatens the global economy and sovereignty of nations worldwide. He also says that the so-called economic D-Day is Donald Trump's attempt to divert attention from his administration's debt crisis. Isan Kevani reports from Tehran.
Iran says that the U.S. has pursued its maximum pressure policy for years, especially during Trump's first term. But Tehran says such extreme measures will never force it to surrender, and that this very dead end is what led Washington and Tel Aviv to launch a war against Iran last year. Now, Iranian officials say continued economic pressure will not produce a different result. Deputy Foreign Minister Kazem Gharibabadi pointed to what he sees as the core issue. American officials keep miscalculating and then feel compelled to cover up each mistake by creating an even bigger failure. Gharibabadi says military war produced no results, and now U.S. officials have named the next defeat an economic war. The rhetorical clash between Tehran and Washington shows no signs of letting up, but regardless of which side ultimately gains the upper hand, the real burden falls on ordinary Iranians, and they're struggling with fuel shortages, frequent power outages, and most critically, inflation at levels they have not seen in decades.
And in the meantime, talks are underway in Washington between the U.S. and Canada. That is after U.S. President Donald Trump announced new tariffs on the country's closest ally that are set to go into effect before the weekend. Here's more from Jim Spellman.
U.S. President Donald Trump threatened to put in place 50% tariffs on up to $20 billion worth of Canadian goods with a Tuesday deadline. He then extended that until Friday night at midnight, saying a deal was in place subject to finalization of documents. Trump and Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney have spoken on the phone multiple times in recent days, and in a virtual meeting on Wednesday, Carney briefed regional leaders on the ongoing negotiations. On Thursday, Canada's trade minister and staff were in Washington to meet with their U.S. counterparts.
We had a long, detailed meeting with Ambassador Greer and his colleagues. You may notice Madame Charette remains in the building to continue that work. Canadians expect us to get a deal that's in the economic interest of Canada and Canadian workers. We're very close. We continue to make progress, and we're going to stay here and do the work that's necessary until we get to that point.
No details have been officially released, but some U.S. media outlets report talks are centered around reducing U.S. tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, plus the auto industry, which is closely integrated on both sides of the border. If a deal is finalized, Canada will reportedly agree to lift a partial boycott of U.S. wine and liquor. Many businesses in the U.S. oppose these proposed tariffs with close trading partner Canada, arguing it drives up their cost of doing business and raises prices for consumers. Democrats argue Trump's trade policies are hurting the U.S. economy.
President Trump's tariff policy, on again, off again, arbitrary, capricious, malicious, it has hurt families in Illinois and across the country. The average family in Illinois has paid more than $2,200 more since President Trump was elected because of tariffs. It's cost the Illinois economy more than $5 billion in GDP. It's not making us stronger. It's hurting our economy and it's hurting American families.
It's not clear what a limited bilateral trade deal on these issues might mean for the larger U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade deal currently up for renewal. Jim Spellman, CGTN, Washington.
And that's going to do it for this edition of Global Business on CGTN. I'm Lily Lu in Beijing. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.